Okay, welcome to this section 29, Karen Armstrong, Anthology, A-Level Buddhism Text Analysis. Let's read it. After his victory over Mara, which was really a victory over himself, there was nothing to hold Gautama back. The gods returned from the heavens and waited breathlessly to achieve his final release. But they needed his help as much as did any human being. Now, Gautama entered the first jhana and penetrated the inner world of his psyche. When he finally reached the peace of Nibbana, all the worlds of the Buddhist cosmos were convulsed. The heavens and hells shook. The Bodhi tree rained down red florets on the enlightened man. Throughout all the worlds, the flowering trees bloomed. The fruit trees were all weighed down by the burden of their fruit. The trunk lotuses bloomed on the trunk of trees. The system of 10,000 worlds was like a bouquet of flowers sent whirling through the air. The ocean lost its salty taste. The blind and deaf were able to see and hear. Cripples could walk, and the fetters of prisoners fell to the ground. Everything suddenly glimpsed new freedom and potency. For a few moments, each form of life was able to become more fully itself. What is all this hyperbole about? So, is Armstrong rejecting or reflecting at least the classical Theravada commentorial Buddhism or something else after this victory over Mara, which had really been a victory over himself, individual? There was nothing to hold Gautama back. So Theravada frames the journey to enlightenment as an individual pursuit. Himself, which Mahayana has been historically critical of. Yet none of that polemics here is acknowledged in Armstrong's homogenized text, her own hagiographic account, her pluralist secular Buddha. Yet all this does, yet probably she's just reflecting her own, to use Charles Taylor's term, individual expressionism. It's you versus the world, and it's you've just got to find your authentic self. And the Buddhism just discovers his authenticity, the ethics of authenticity. He has learned to express himself like a modern pop star. And this is in contrast, actually, both not just to Mahayana and to Theravada, because the expression of the self, well, it's not the expression of the self, but the death of the self, the realization the self is anatta, subject to radical impermanence, anicca. And if you don't, you're going to experience dukkha, insight into the three marks of existence. So as Armstrong, a view on the status and reality of the gods. The gods returned from the heavens and waited breathlessly for him to achieve his final release. They needed his help as much as any human being. Well, Armstrong does not engage in discussion of the ontological status or reality of gods, capital G or small, nor does she enlighten us as to the narrative function of deities in these folk stories, these folk tales of the 5th century AD that purport to go back to the 5th century BC. These hagiographic questions of developments and syncretism with local religions and hence the need to, even if it's just perfunctorily, include reference to deities to keep everybody on board, like Christians doing, I don't know, well dressing or some other pagan practice just to keep the locals on board, are left unanswered by Armstrong. She just doesn't critically engage. Does Armstrong use a psychological interpretation of enlightenment? I've mentioned this before. She says, now Gautama entered the first jhana and penetrated the inner world of his what? His psyche. Yes, it does seem yet again the influence of the depth psychologist Freud and Jung looms over her interpretation of enlightenment, and the religious experience of the Buddha is interpreted by Western psychological terms. The psyche is not quite the same as in Western thinking as it is in Buddhism. Does Armstrong ever differentiate between folk tales and authoritative text? What does she say? When he finally reached the peace of Nibbana, all the worlds, the Buddhist cosmos, were convulsed. The heavens and hells shook. The Bodhi tree rained down red florets on the enlightened man. None of this is in the original, or very little of this is, if anything, is in the original Tipitaka, in the Sutta Pitaka. And she doesn't tell us about how these embellished details are from this folk culture tradition that has been picked up like a snowball picking up a rubble on the way down a hill. She doesn't critically tell us about that, and we must be critical of her lack of scholarly work, because of her populist intention. Maybe she could do it. Maybe she's not worried about doing it. So what kind of religious language is Armstrong using here when she says, throughout all the worlds, the flowering trees bloomed, the fruit trees were weighed down by the burden of the fruit, the trunk lotuses bloomed, the trunks of trees, the system of 10,000 worlds was like a bouquet of flowers whirling through the air. Well, trees carry varied symbolism depending on the tradition within Theravada and Mahayana. Understanding different truths, in fact, with the same symbolism. So what form of religious language? This is poetic language. A non-cognitive symbolism that someone like Paul Tillich would have something to say about. It's not intended to be cognitive or literal. The actual trees actually flower and everything else? Probably not. So what kind of what does Armstrong's own poetic symbolism mean here? The ocean lost its salty taste. The blind and the deaf were able to hear and see. The cripples could walk, and fetters of prisoners fell to the ground. Armstrong's own theology of potency or self-actualization, perhaps reminiscent of the humanist psychologists like Maslow's, this hierarchy of needs, where the final level of fullness or enoughness is self-actualization, some flattened yet the way the buffered self can sort of experience something spiritual. Is this sort of Western secular view of spirituality. The individual can find their spiritual self, even if there's no transcendent. Now, other religions, Christians, would be critical of this. Is typical of the heresy of Pelagius, that I can do it myself. I don't need a God. I don't need grace from above. That it was by the individual's power, the self's power. Now, self versus other is an important thing in Mahayana. Pure Land thinkers of Mahayana would suggest that we should look to Amitabha as one of the enlightened transcendent ones to help us. What does Rahula say? A fascinating class of mythical bodhisattvas. These guys don't exist, Theravada would say. But again, Armstrong doesn't bring our attention to these critical debates. So this was section 29.